Grand Rising, everybody. Okay, let's see here. Okay, on February the 5th, ladies and gentlemen, number one big money pattern. I told my VIP, if you want to win, focus on my top 3 digits. This happens to be a prerequisite to join my VIP. So you need to write this down and convey this to me so I know that you know what to do. Again, number one, you see it right there for yourself, 742. I told the VIP 742. I promised that I could make that happen. Ladies and gentlemen, 2464. Ladies and gentlemen, I promised my number one big money pattern would manifest between the dates February 2nd and February the 11th. The number one big money pattern. Ladies and gentlemen, 9818, February 5th. Ladies and gentlemen, I guaranteed my VIP that I could meet the deadline date on that prediction. Ladies and gentlemen, you have your 931. Ladies and gentlemen, 913 is a big money pattern that I promised would manifest between the dates February the 1st and February the 10th in Tennessee. Ladies and gentlemen, as you can see, the black sheep told us the truth, said it would be a combination that nobody would be thinking about. Therefore, it would be the highest probability of it being drawn. Ladies and gentlemen, 497. Ladies and gentlemen, I promised my VIP that 497 would manifest straight, indicating it with the triple dollar sign, which I promised, the 3 to 2 triple dollar signs that I will place on the prediction, they will manifest. Ladies and gentlemen, you have your 4850. Ladies and gentlemen, I promised to manifest my top 2 big money patterns. Ladies and gentlemen, as you can see, I did this at 5:25 a.m. You see it for yourself. To win, focus on my top 4 digits. I promise the first 2, 1, 2. 16 hours is all it took. I tell you, in most cases, I don't practice this shit, but I can make it happen in 24 to 48 hours. That right there is record breaking. Ladies and gentlemen, you have your 8013. Ladies and gentlemen, I promise the top 2 big money patterns would manifest in Ohio between the dates 131 and February the 9th. Here I go showing off. Ladies and gentlemen, I promised the very last motherfucking number you see would manifest first on February the 5th, and it did. Ladies and gentlemen, 535. Ladies and gentlemen, the only motherfucking big money pattern on fire. I told my VIP that number would manifest straight, promising its debut. Ladies and gentlemen, you see your 677. Ladies and gentlemen, again and again and again, a 5-year-old can pick out fire, which I promise it will not let you down. Straight. Ladies and gentlemen, you have your 732. Ladies and gentlemen, the black sheep will not lie. Told you it would manifest straight on February the 5th. Here I go showing off again, ladies and gentlemen, number one motherfucking big money pattern. Again, and again, I'm telling you the truth. Ladies and gentlemen, 4960. Ladies and gentlemen, again, the only motherfucking big money pattern on fire for Georgia. You see it for yourself. February the 2nd to February the 12th. Ladies and gentlemen, 6464. Ladies and gentlemen, as you can see, the black sheep on time to manifest on February the 5th. Ladies and gentlemen, 832. Boom, boom, boom. I promise that you would see this happen between the dates 2/4 and 2/14. Straight. Ladies and gentlemen, 485. Ladies and gentlemen, my only motherfucking big money pattern on fire for Texas between the dates 2/2 and 2/11. Straight. Ladies and gentlemen, 908. Ladies and gentlemen, I promise 908 would manifest straight in Texas between the dates 1/30 and February the 9th. Ladies and gentlemen, 586. Ladies and gentlemen, I promise my number one motherfucking big money pattern. Texas, for Texas. Between the dates February the 4th and February the 13th. Straight! Here I go showing off again. Ladies and gentlemen, Texas, number one! You see it for yourself. Boom, boom, boom. Ladies and gentlemen, you have your 1880. Ladies and gentlemen, the black sheep do not lie. Told you it would manifest 131 to February the 9th in Texas. Here I go showing off again. Ladies and gentlemen, I guarantee the number 3 big money pattern would manifest February the 5th. You see it for yourself. On February the 4th, I gave it to him. Less than 24 motherfucking hours. You got it. Here we go again, showing off, ladies and gentlemen, again and again and again. I will provide the winning big money pattern, which is a combination that has a energy signature. Ladies and gentlemen, you have 5836. Boom, boom, boom. Your number one motherfucking big money pattern. Texas, 131 to February the 9th. You see it for yourself. Ladies and gentlemen, 0934. Boom, boom, boom. Only 9 motherfucking hours. On February the 5th, you see it for yourself. Ladies and gentlemen, 879. Ladies and gentlemen, 879. I promise that you would see this manifestation happen. And I don't practice this shit, but I can make it happen in 24 to 48 hours. Ladies and gentlemen, 480, your number one motherfucking big money pattern for New York. I do all states. Ladies and gentlemen, 759. Ladies and gentlemen, your number one big money motherfucking pattern for New York. 22 to 211. Ladies and gentlemen, 7183. Ladies and gentlemen, for New York, your only motherfucking big money pattern on fire. February the 1st to 210. Here I go showing off. Boom, boom, boom. You see it for yourself, guaranteed, over and over and over again and again. Ladies and gentlemen, Tennessee, 641. Ladies and gentlemen, I guaranteed straight 641 for Tennessee. Here I go again, showing off. Boom, boom, boom. Big money patterns hardly ever lie. You see it for yourself. February the 2nd to February the 11th. Ladies and gentlemen, here we go. 1067. Ladies and gentlemen, on yesterday's date, I turned 21,900,000 years old. Yes, I did. And look at this. Your number 4 big money pattern, Tennessee, 131 to 29. Ladies and gentlemen, here we go again, guaranteed to manifest. Only 5 motherfucking hours for it to debut. Here we go again, black sheep, never lying to me. Ladies and gentlemen, here you go again, 9417. Ladies and gentlemen, I guaranteed and promised to make this happen by the deadline date. You see it for yourself. February 6th was the deadline date for that manifestation. I made it happen. Ladies and gentlemen, here we go and showing off again. I promised the triple dollar signs would go to Texas. They went to Texas, February the 2nd to February the 11th. Ladies and gentlemen, you see your one deuce deuce. Ladies and gentlemen, as you can see, I promised the very last motherfucking number you see would manifest first on February the 6th. You see it for yourself between the dates 2-1 and 2-10. Ladies and gentlemen, you see it for yourself 4-8-9. Ladies and gentlemen, this was for Georgia. Georgia for Georgia. You see it for yourself. I promised this would happen in 6 motherfucking hours. Ladies and gentlemen, you have your 8979. I promised to make the deadline date with the only motherfucking big money pattern on fire. 129 to February the 6th. Boom, boom, boom. Ladies and gentlemen, here we go again. 0439. Ladies and gentlemen, number 1 motherfucking big money pattern. You see it for yourself. On February the 6th. Boom, boom, boom. Only 5 motherfucking hours. Ladies and gentlemen, 561. Boom, boom, boom. I triple dollar signed that big money pattern to manifest by February the 6th. Boom, boom, boom. Ladies and gentlemen, as you can see, here we go with the cheat sheet action. Here we go again from February the 1st to February the 10th. Cheat sheet for advanced investors will manifest. You see it for yourself. Boom, 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 boom. Georgia 334. Ladies and gentlemen, as you can see, boom, 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 black sheep, on time to manifest 433. Ladies and gentlemen, you have your 1257. Ladies and gentlemen, cheat sheet, don't lie, promised you would see that very last number you see manifesting first. Boom, boom, boom. Ladies and gentlemen, you got 1860. You got it right there, triple dollar sign, that big money pattern. And you see it right there for Florida. That means that it was done in Florida, so you can get it in Florida. Between the dates 131 and February the 9th, it dropped on February the 6th. Ladies and gentlemen, 284. Ladies and gentlemen, as you can see, I triple dollar signed it for Florida on February the 5th. It dropped on February the 6th, the very next day. Ladies and gentlemen, you got 087. Ladies and gentlemen, 087, guaranteed to manifest straight in Florida. Ladies and gentlemen, you got your 5234. Ladies and gentlemen, guaranteed to manifest the number 3 big money pattern between the dates February 3rd and February 12th. Ladies and gentlemen, you see your 166 for New York. Ladies and gentlemen, I promise straight New York would get that 166 between the dates 22 and 211. Ladies and gentlemen, 536. Ladies and gentlemen, I promise to manifest that in Tennessee for Tennessee. Ladies and gentlemen, you see your 8449. Black sheep don't lie, 8944 to manifest 24 to 213. Ladies and gentlemen, you have your 5802. Ladies and gentlemen, I promise by the deadline, you would see the very last number you see manifesting first. Ladies and gentlemen, 448. Ladies and gentlemen, my only motherfucking big money pattern on fire, designed to manifest between the dates February the 3rd and February the 13th. Ladies and gentlemen, 271. Ladies and gentlemen, I promised the top 2 would manifest in Michigan. You see it for yourself, February the 4th to February the 13th. Here I go showing off again. Ladies and gentlemen, as you can see, same day manifestation. Right there, you see it for yourself on February the 6th. Boom, boom, boom to 215. You will see this number over and over and over again. Ladies and gentlemen, 9609. Ladies and gentlemen, the black sheep on time to manifest on February the 6th. Ladies and gentlemen, here I go showing off again. You see the black sheep is on time over and over and over again for Michigan. Ladies and gentlemen, 4053. Ladies and gentlemen, as you can see, I triple dollar signed it, promising it would make its debut the very next day. I gave it to you on February the 5th. I told you for investment purposes only, you would see this manifestation. Ladies and gentlemen, you have your 298. Ladies and gentlemen, 289, your number one big money pattern. Ladies and gentlemen, as you can see, the black sheep, 298, nobody was going to be doing it. And guess what? It was Ohio for Ohio, right there. Boom, boom, boom. Ladies and gentlemen, 055. Ladies and gentlemen, 055. I promise would manifest straight between the dates 25 and 214. It dropped on 26. Boom, boom, boom. Ladies and gentlemen, 4647. Ladies and gentlemen, as you can see, I guarantee the number 4 big money pattern, Florida, for Florida. You don't have to do all 7 catalyst states. You can do the respective state for that state. Ladies and gentlemen, here you go again. He's showing off. You see it again and again and again. Numbers don't lie, at least not mine. Ladies and gentlemen, boom, boom, boom. Strong black sheep on time to manifest over and over and over again. As you can see, look, 1, 2, 3. It's over and over and over again. I'm giving you the same motherfucking winning numbers. As you can see, 7, 6, 5, 2. Ladies and gentlemen, I promise to manifest 5, 2, 7, 6. Big money pattern. You see it for yourself. North Carolina, 2-3 to 212. And I did this at 4:15 a.m. You see it for yourself. Ladies and gentlemen, as you can see, I guarantee to manifest this number in North Carolina. You see it over and over and over again. Ladies and gentlemen, as you can see, the black sheep is not lying. Boom, boom, boom. Straight! I told you that nobody would be thinking about that big money pattern. Y'all don't hear me though. Ladies and gentlemen, 534. Ladies and gentlemen, as you can see, the number 1 motherfucking big money pattern made it by the deadline date, February the 6th. Ladies and gentlemen, as you can see, 928. Ladies and gentlemen, 928. Guaranteed to manifest straight within a few hours in Georgia. Ladies and gentlemen, you have your 365. Ladies and gentlemen, I promise to manifest it on February the 6th. Put the triple dollar signs by that big money pattern and made it happen. Ladies and gentlemen, you got your 5601. Ladies and gentlemen, I promise to manifest that big money pattern on February the 6th between the dates 1:30 and February the 9th. Ladies and gentlemen, 2730. Ladies and gentlemen, as you can see, I promise to manifest that big money pattern. Top 2. To win, you need to focus on my top 5. I promise the first 2 will manifest February the 4th to February the 13th in Texas. I told you I don't practice this shit, but guess what? I can make it happen in 24 to 48 hours. Boom, boom, boom. Ladies and gentlemen, 5398. Ladies and gentlemen, number 1 motherfucking big money pattern. This was Texas for motherfucking Texas. How do you miss? If I'm telling you, it will roll out in Texas and then travel. Y'all not listening to me. Ladies and gentlemen, you have your 69. What is that? 36. Boom, boom, boom. Black sheep, on time. February the 2nd to February the 11th. I told you no one would be thinking about that. Ladies and gentlemen, 907. Ladies and gentlemen, I promise 907 would make its debut straight in Texas. 131 to February the 9th. Ladies and gentlemen, as you can see, 715. Ladies and gentlemen, I promise 715 would manifest straight Texas for Texas on February the 6th. No wait. Woo! Ladies and gentlemen, 154. Ladies and gentlemen, number one motherfucking big money pattern. Straight Texas for Texas. Woo! Ladies and gentlemen, again, when I tell you that I've been doing this shit for almost 22 million motherfucking years, and you don't want to hear me, and you don't want to listen to me, then guess what? I can't help you. And that's what I'm here to do. I'm here to help. I am the genie out of the bottle. And I'm here to make the manifestations happen for you in your life. But if you don't believe in fire, and if you don't believe in the number one number, there's nothing that I can do for you, because this is for investment purposes only. And when I tell you that the energy, frequency, and vibration of a combination is about to make its debut, and you don't hear me, you not listening, you're not paying attention, guess what? I can't help you. I'll see everybody at the winner's table no matter what. Abundant prosperity in health and in wealth to all who follow me and believe in the hard work that you see me accomplishing every single day.